Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. Today we are sitting with the estimable Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei. Ken Moriyasu is a Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia. It's really one of the leading news media organizations from the world's largest continent, and it's based out of Japan. Ken is also a friend of the show. We've had Ken on our program since the Clubhouse days, and he's been so kind as to return since we've moved to the pre-recorded podcast format. Ken's really an expert on all matters of foreign policy and security policy, especially when it comes to Japan's position in the world and also how it all connects to the U.S. Now that Ken is here in the United States, it's easier to organize meetings with him on a familiar time zone. And we are so glad to have him with us again. Thank you for coming back, Ken.
Hi, thanks for having me, John. It's great to be back.
So we are using the occasion of the recent state visit as a launching pad for this, I think, pretty broad conversation about the U.S.-Japan relationship and how both countries are looking at dynamics around the world. So we had a visit very recently from the Prime Minister of Japan, Kishida. He visited the White House, he visited the U.S. Congress, and there was all of the trappings and pomp and ceremony that always accompany a state visit. And sometimes it's a little bit difficult, I suppose, to separate all of that from the substance of an event like this. So, Ken, could you tell us a little bit about what really is the value of a state visit for a foreign leader in Washington? What are they really hoping to get out of an occasion like this one?
So for us journalists, we had to be very careful about the wording because state visits are reserved for heads of state. And for Japan, the head of state is the emperor. So only the emperor can come on a state visit. We describe it as a state level visit because it has all the only difference between the emperor's state visit and Kishida's visit this time was a 21 gun salute to the 19 gun salute. So Kishida was missing 2 gun salutes. That's the only difference because he had all the flags of Japan across Washington. He had a state dinner. And he also, when you come on a state visit, you have to go to one more state other than Washington, D.C. And this time, Kishida went to North Carolina. It ticked all the boxes of the menu of a state visit, but we just don't call it a state visit. It's officially called an official visit, which is separated from a regular visit, which is called a bilateral working visit.
Ken, I am now going to have to email so many American news personalities who have been describing this as a state visit. I'm so glad that you've helped us make this clarification. Ken, when was the last time that we had a proper state visit with Japan?
Shinzo Abe came in 2015, so 9 years ago. That was a state-level visit. Kishida's visit very much mirrored Abe's visit. Both of them gave a speech to Congress, but the message of those congressional speeches were very different in that Abe was like only gradually talking about an alliance of hope and that the US and Japan are looking towards the future, the distant future in the same way. Kishida was very different. Kishida came to Washington with a specific plan, and that plan was to tell the Americans, I know you're tired. I know you're exhausted by being the policeman of the world. You don't have to do this alone. We're with you. So is Australia, so is South Korea. Let's create a lattice work of alliances, and let's all defend the international order. So that message was so much more specific than Shinzo Abe's, and it just shows how Japan has evolved, the alliance has evolved in the 9 years since. A lot of it is that Japan has changed its resolve towards the US alliance, but it's also, after going through the period of Donald Trump, that America is rethinking its alliances. So it's a combination of those, and the elephant in the room is China's stance. Under Xi Jinping, China is a very different country from Hu Jintao's China. So all 3 of those elements have combined to bring Japan to where it is today.
So, as he was saying, this has been kind of a big week. The news comes ahead of the Japanese Prime Minister making a historic visit to North Carolina today. Fumio Kishida will be treated to barbecue and Southern hospitality, of course, today as he tours some of the biggest Japanese companies in the state. Japan invests more money than any foreign country into North Carolina. Governor Cooper plans to greet him when he arrives at RDU this afternoon.
Ken, you mentioned that when Kishida came to the United States for this visit, state visitor, state level visit, or official visit, not only did he visit Washington, but he also went to North Carolina because a U.S. state has to be added in addition to the capital. Can you tell us a little bit about why North Carolina was selected and what he did on that part of the visit?
Yes. North Carolina was chosen because it's close to Washington, D.C. That's number one reason. But also, it is where Toyota is building a new EV factory. Honda has a factory for its airplanes. And the governor, Roy Cooper, is very close to U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel. He's a rising star in the Democratic Party. North Carolina is a major swing state. So for all those reasons, it made sense to go to North Carolina. What was very interesting was that this is part of a strategy on the Japanese side to conduct what is called subnational diplomacy. It's not just state-to-state diplomacy, but Japan's intent was to show the Americans and the world that Japan has established a good relationship with American states, all 50 states actually, because Japan is one of the very few countries that has foreign direct investment in all 50 states. But North Carolina is very big in terms of new investments. And it goes to show whoever the president is, whether it's Biden or Trump in November, the US-Japan alliance is solid at the base because it's supported by these ties Japanese companies have established with the states.
So, Ken, for leaders like Kishida, are they thinking that if Trump comes back to the White House and countries that don't engage in bribery and corrupt practices, countries like Japan, if they don't have the opportunity to reach the White House in the same way that countries that are willing to bribe and corrupt the American political process do, they'll continue their engagement by engaging at the subnational levels of American government, by engaging with states, by engaging maybe a little bit where they can with Congress, but not looking only to the White House for the relationship.
Yeah, so there's a nice analogy by a famous Japanese diplomat who said every 4 years, Japan has to face the US presidential election like it's Christmas Day. And you wake up, you go under the Christmas tree, and whatever you get as the present, you open up the present and you have to say every 4 years the same thing. This is exactly what I wanted. So whatever the result is, Japan has to say that this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted Trump to come back. I wanted Biden to be reelected. Whatever the outcome is, Japan has to live with it. What is different from the past, I think, is that in the past, you would have a president, you'd hate it, but you pretend you liked it. But what is happening right now is the stakes are so high that Japan is preparing itself to love either president. So it is thinking very hard how a Trump presidency can benefit Japan, how a second Biden presidency can benefit Japan, and it's trying to make the most of it. There will be adjustments, but the idea is to be able to adapt to either way. And the subnational diplomacy, the relationship with the governors, come in handy, especially for a Trump administration, because he's all about trade. And if Japan can make a case to Trump that Japan is the largest foreign investor in America for 4 consecutive years, and next year too, it'll be 5 consecutive years, Japan thinks that would be a convincing argument to have a scrum with Trump and to rebuild America together. So I think that'll be the message.
Ken, you mentioned that in the past, there were presidents that the Japanese leadership privately hated, but wouldn't admit publicly. Now I have to ask you who some of those presidents might have been.
Well, Japan didn't like Obama. Abe Shinzo Abe personally didn't like Obama because the Japanese always do a psychological test of the American presidents. And the psychological test conducted on Obama came back saying that this person doesn't like to build personal relationships with anybody. He likes to read books. So Abe kind of didn't invest his personal time and energy to establishing a friendship with Obama. But more importantly, the whole idea of not being the world's policeman anymore and leading from behind, those really don't fit with the strategy. And Japan, with a rising China next to it, needs America to be the leader of the world. And Kishida and his National Security Council have a very clear-cut policy of how can we encourage Americans to stay the leader of the world and to help it. And this comes at a price for Japan because until now, Japan tried to play it both ways with America and China. But clearly, Japan understands that that's not going to work. If Japan does that, America's going to say, well, let China take over. So Japan has decided that a China-led world is probably not going to be comfortable for Japan as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power. So it has all its chips in the American side, and it's thinking of how it can prolong the American leadership.
Yeah, Ken, I think that this is really sort of the big question of the day, isn't it? This question of the role that the U.S. wants to play in the world going forward. You talked about the perception that in the post-Cold War years, the first 2 decades after the Cold War, there was the idea that the U.S. could be the world's policeman, and that some of our recent presidents, including President Obama, including Donald Trump, have expressed a reluctance to play that role. And this is something that's really been in the news a lot lately because of these discussions in the U.S. about whether we would go ahead and provide this defensive aid to Ukraine, play a role in Ukraine's defense against this war of aggression from Russia. And there have been figures in American politics who have connected this very much to how it concerns our partners in the Asia Pacific region. I've got some quotes from Senator Mitt Romney of Utah from his interview with Kaitlan Collins a couple months ago, where he's talking about the Ukraine aid. And he says, the question is whether we're going to help freedom fighters around the world who are our friends and allies generally. He says, this is a message that's important to the people in Taiwan, to the people in Japan. Can you count on America? Or is America so isolationist that it doesn't care what happens to the rest of us? So, Ken, the question that Romney is suggesting, is this really the same thing that people in Japan are thinking?
Right. So in the Iraq War of 2003, Japan sided with the US. And back then, I think the thinking was, well, Japan is going to stand with America because America is Japan's sole ally. It's a treaty ally, and it has promised to defend us. So we will stand with America, regardless of whether we believe that there are weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's another point. And whether it goes through the UN, we don't really have to scrutinize that. That was Japan's stance. Japan's stance today is not siding with America because America is our treaty ally. Japan's strategy is now to say we want to defend the rules-based, free and open international order. And because America is standing for the international order, we will fight together and we will bring all the people, like-minded people who want to preserve this international order, and we will fight against forces who want to create a new order, namely Russia and China. So I think that's the framing. And in terms of Ukraine, yes, there is an argument if America provides Ukraine with Patriot missiles. Those Patriot missiles are crucial to the war in Taiwan and for the defense of Japan. America has asked for Japan to backfill the stockpiles that they've given to Ukraine. Japan cannot directly give it to Ukraine, and Japan has agreed to backfill American warehouses. But the net sum is that there are less Patriot missiles in the Indo-Pacific today. And there has been an argument that we should say no. We should convince America that China is the pacing threat and that America doesn't have the luxury of fighting 3 wars in Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan, and America should keep its arms for Taiwan. The other argument is that no, like you said, if we prevent Putin from doing what he wants and preserve the international order, then that would deter China, and that would also unite all the countries when there is a Taiwan crisis, to come to Japan's aid, Taiwan's aid. So I think that's the logic. I don't know if this is going to work, because if America uses all its Patriot missiles, then it might be a cakewalk for China. So we'll have another podcast then.
So that's pretty interesting, Ken. I mean, what you're describing is that basically there's a single goal, which is to see the United States support Japan's defense, support Taiwan's defense. And there's different ways of looking at how Ukraine fits into that. On one hand, basically the argument that's put forward by Senator Romney is, if you are a partner of America's who wants to see that America will back you up, you just want to see resolve. You want to see that America is willing to defend a partner like Ukraine, because it shows a willingness to generally support partners. It shows that America is not moving in an isolationist direction. But then the other argument is the one that you're kind of introducing here, which is that maybe it's a little bit more zero sum. The weapons and equipment that are going to Ukraine thus can't also be going to the Pacific. So if those are the two different ways of looking at this, which way, Ken, do you think the Japanese leadership look at this question of those two perspectives?
So the Japanese leadership has clearly chosen the Romney way, and it has come out and tweeted, I think the Japanese foreign ministry tweeted, "We will forever stand with Ukraine," or something like that. It was quite an eyebrow raiser. So the way to compensate this zero sum was one of the agreements of this Biden-Kishida summit, and that is for Japan to use its defense industrial base to help America's industrial base, because America just doesn't have the capacity anymore. So they're going to start with jointly developing and jointly producing munitions, missiles in Japan. And then if that goes well, then they'll start thinking about maybe making training planes. And then if that goes well, then maybe ships and fighter jets in the future. And one American official told me it is integrating Japan's manufacturing abilities into the US defense industrial base. So they're thinking of Japan as an extension of America's defense industrial base, which was totally unthinkable 5 years ago.
It's interesting, Ken, that there's been so much focus in the American discourse on what Europe are doing to support Ukraine. There's been less focus on the role that Japan is playing in all of this. But I kind of, as you've described it, Japan do have a role to play in supporting this broad effort to build up armaments. Do you think that the Japanese leadership and the Japanese public see themselves as a component of this coalition, this international coalition, at a level that's similar to what the US and EU countries are doing, or maybe a smaller role?
So the pace of Japan's shift in defense policy has been so fast and so drastic that there really hasn't been a general election since Kishida started down this path. So there will be an election in the coming months. The opinion polls are generally supportive of this path of standing with America and defending the international order, increasing the defense budget. That really has broad support. When it comes to the details, like do we raise taxes to fund it, then people start saying, no, maybe I don't like that. But in general, even the opposition parties are pretty much united in the need for Japan to bulk up its defenses.
I suppose I'm a little bit curious about how much the Ukrainian cause resonates in Japan. When I visit European countries, recently I was in Sweden. I've also been to Ireland, a couple other places since 2022, and I see the Ukrainian flag flying on people's houses, in public places, in government buildings, a lot of the time at embassies. And I wonder if it's like that in Japan, if the Ukrainian cause resonates. I mean, of course, Sweden are so much closer to Ukraine than Japan are. But Japan's not very far away from Russia, even if Japan is far away from Ukraine. And Japan even has some territorial disputes with Russia and a history of wars against Russia and the Soviet Union. So is the Ukrainian cause something that has that kind of emotional resonance that feels like a national priority for Japan?
In terms of sympathy towards Ukraine, I wouldn't say it is as strong as Sweden. but the hatred of Russia is very much strong because of what happened in the last days of World War II, when the Soviet Union tore up a non-aggression treaty and just decided to invade Japan, and that brought forward the complete surrender. So, and they took islands, 4 of our islands, 4 of Japan's islands. Definitely, there is a distrust of Russia, especially a distrust of Vladimir Putin. I think there was more hope of signing a peace treaty with Boris Yeltsin, but there is no love for Putin in Japan.
Ken, since we're talking about the move towards a more assertive defense and military posture in Japan, before we started recording, you mentioned a trilateral conference with the USA and the Philippines. There was also some talk in the news about whether Japan might join the AUKUS partnership. That's the nuclear submarine project that the USA, the United Kingdom, and Australia have embarked on. Do you see that Japan are joining formal military initiatives? We've been talking about the armament matter. Can you tell us a little bit more about the moves that Japan are making on the security front?
So AUKUS has 2 parts. The first part is the nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines that the US and the UK are providing Australia. Japan has no interest in joining this program because first, it's super expensive. 2, Japan doesn't need nuclear-powered submarines because Japan's defense is all around the Japanese waters. The key, as you know, of the nuclear-powered submarine is that they can go underwater for 3 months. Australia needs it because there's a vast amount of water around it that it needs to protect. Japan doesn't need that. And also Japan is looking at, how the shipyard capability in the US and the UK is going to make that AUKUS project very, very hard. So Japan has absolutely no interest in joining that part. The second part, pillar 2 of AUKUS, is like future technologies like AI, quantum computing, and all these things that could help bolster the defenses, the war of the future. And it seems that the Americans are very keen on bringing Japan into that part. Japan is not saying no, but it's not that enthusiastic. That's why they couldn't announce Japan joining this time. They said they will consider it. I hear that Japan is a little worried about countries like Indonesia being very skeptical about AUKUS. And I think Japan feels that it doesn't really need to make a big splash about joining AUKUS right now at the cost of alienating countries like Indonesia, which Japan sees as very much on the fence. And Japan needs all the soft power diplomacy it can to keep Indonesia on the side of defending the current international order. I think that's more important for Japan than teaming up with Australia and UK and US for AUKUS.
That does seem to make sense to me, Ken, because it seems as though traditionally, before this recent period that we've been talking about, the role that Japan have been playing in this broad international partnership has been primarily an economic role. Of course, when the TPP trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, fell apart, or at least the United States' role in it fell apart, the United States' leading role in it fell apart. Japan were the ones to take up the mantle as the leader of that initiative and kept it together and kept all of these other countries in the Pacific on board with this trade deal. So, we're talking about the ways that Japan are increasingly contributing to the military and defense aspects of these partnerships. But Japan have always had this crucial role on the economic side, right?
Yeah, so I think they're looking at its experience and success in uniting and maintaining the TPP countries together when the US left. And they're trying to apply that to national security as well. What I mean by that is that America is going to go through political turmoil in every election cycle, but that's to be expected. In the past, Japan might have despaired that happening, but now today's Japan is more like that is calculated, and that's part of the calculation. And Japan, like it did with TPP, can stand up and hold the fort while America sorts out its political turmoil. And then with the belief that America will come back, as seen by the passage of the National Security Bill this week.
So do you think the TPP was something that might have come up during Kishida's conversations with President Biden or others in Washington? Do they still have any hope that the U.S. might come back to the table on that trade initiative? Or is that all just too far in the past, not worth trying to bring up again? A dead horse.
Yeah, it's a total dead horse. I heard from Japanese officials that the joke is there's something called the 5-second rule. In U.S.-Japan bilateral negotiations, every time Japan brings up TPP, it takes 5 seconds for America to reject it, refute it, saying that's not happening. So it's a dead horse. But America is very keen on engaging economically, and I think they're trying that with the Philippines. And that is to strengthen bilateral relations with each country. And with the Philippines, which is case number one, Raymondo took a business delegation with lots of CEOs. They committed like $1 billion of investments. And they're also trying to encourage Philippine critical minerals to apply for subsidies under the Inflation Reduction Act. So in that way, offering tangible economic benefits to one country, and then the neighbors can see that, and then saying, maybe we want that too. So I think there is a will to try to engage more economically with the region. And Japan, I think, understands that like regional trade pacts are probably not going to work anymore. So that's fine.
In this conversation, we've mentioned a few examples of countries that seem to have a promising trend in relations and then brought in a new leadership that moved things in a more adversarial direction. We talked about China under Hu and then Xi, and Russia under Yeltsin, and then Putin, the USA under previous leaders after the Cold War, and then Obama and Trump. I suppose we should also point at these instances where new leadership has meant a positive turn in relations. And maybe that does include the Philippines, who went from Rodrigo Duterte, a more Sinophile leader, to Bongbong Marcos, who seems much more interested in building this U.S.-Japan relationship. Maybe that's also what happened in Korea, Ken, with the leader Yoon, who came into power, I think, last year, who has made a pretty significant effort to repair a pretty broken relationship with Japan at that time, right?
Yeah, so Yoon Suk-yeol's pivot to Japan on the US-Japan South Korea trilateral engagement is probably the most significant change in the geopolitical landscape in a long time, along with Japan's new resolve to bolster its defenses. Those two have really worked in favor for the US. The idea, I think, is to create as many tangible results in the trilateral community so that if there is a new South Korean president who is not Yoon Suk-yeol and who wants to reject some of the things that Yoon Suk-yeol implemented, there'll be enough tangible things for the new president to break so that he or she would feel satisfied, and there'll be lots of tangible things left. And so they're trying to institutionalize the trilateral collaboration as much as possible.
I think it was just about a week ago, Ken, that there were legislative elections in Korea, and the opposition party, the party that's more Japan skeptic or antagonistic to Japan, have taken the majority in the National Assembly. Is that something that Japan are worried about, that it might partially reverse the trend in positive relations under President Yoon? Or does it not matter because it's not the executive?
Oh, it totally matters. But I think there is a belief that what else is the alternative? For Korea, there is a path to be squarely on the Western side, defending the international order with the US and Japan. The other alternative is to be close to China. If they want that, that's fine too. But I don't think that's a very popular path among the regular people, especially the young people. And then the third path is to be like Israel, to be armed to its teeth and be super neutral but be so armed that it will fight for itself. And that, I think, is just too costly for South Korea, especially for such an export-oriented economy. I think Yoon Suk-yeol's transition to this path was a natural evolution. The key here is for Japan not to mess it up, not to encourage Yoon Suk-yeol's opponents to go down that path. I mean, there are low-hanging fruits like inviting South Korea to G7 meetings every year. That really doesn't cost anything. Subtle gestures like that, I think, are going to be very important to show sincerity to the South Korean people.
Ken, I'm glad you mentioned Israel just then, actually, because something that I was hoping that we could get to in this discussion was the war in Gaza. This is something that, as the Middle East tends to do, has completely overshadowed almost any other international news coverage in the United States. The war in Ukraine, which we've just been talking about, has been put on the back burner. The Israeli attack on Gaza and the ensuing humanitarian emergency, it's really swallowed up almost all of the bandwidth for international attention that our news audiences have. It's galvanized the public on both sides, and it's been a very divisive and controversial issue. Different countries around the world that have complex relationships with the United States are reacting very differently to what's going on. I saw a poll recently of ASEAN countries, some of the countries that we're talking about just now as being important partners for both Japan and the United States, countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam. And what we saw was that since the outbreak of this war and the U.S.'s position to support the Israeli actions, countries in ASEAN that are majority Muslim seem to have moved their public opinion quite strongly and sharply against the United States vis-a-vis China. So countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, that had previously said in polls they prefer the United States as a partner to China, are now saying that they prefer China as a partner to the United States after these events. And, we can't say that correlation equals causation, but certainly there might be a link between this enormous global event and the opinions of people around the world. So we're seeing that in some countries in Asia, there might indeed be a strong reaction against the U.S. because of its position on this war. I want to ask you, Ken, how people in Japan, including the leadership, but also the general public, are looking at all of this.
From a strategic point of view, what's most important for Japan is that America survives this turmoil and comes out of it in a strong position. From Japan's talking points about defending the international order, it would be problematic if America looks like it has double standards, where it's talking about rules-based order, but is perceived as supporting an operation that does not follow the international values within the boundaries of common sense. It would be problematic if America's support for Israel was not based on logic, because I think there is a logic here of Israel being attacked on October 7th, and Israel has a right to defend itself. But of course, there are voices of the international community that cannot be ignored. So whenever it looks like America is siding with Israel and ignoring the international community, that will be problematic for Japan. Japan doesn't really have any religious reasons to support one side. Historically, it has sided with the Arab side in the oil crisis, but that was not due to any ideology, but rather the fact that it faced the threat of oil shortages. So I don't think there's much of a ideological side Japan wants to side with. Meanwhile, on the defense military aspect, Japan is taking lessons from how Israel shot down, Israel together with America and the UK and France and Jordan, shot down 99% of Iran's incoming drones, missiles, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. the Japanese are not really looking at the drones, they're looking at the ballistic missiles and how the US and Israel teamed to jointly take down most of the ballistic missiles, at least to the extent that there was no physical damage on Israel. And the way they did it was the Americans shot down, I think, 6 ballistic missiles from Navy ships in the Eastern Mediterranean, and whatever passed through America's net, the Israelis took down with their own defenses. So that kind of coordination was very educational for the Japanese. Israel and America are not technically treaty allies, and they don't train together and share air defense information regularly. But the fact that they succeeded in teaming up this time is a huge encouragement to the likes of Japan and Australia, who always train with America much more closely than America does with Israel. So there is a hope that maybe, if they're so successful, then we'll be even more successful. But of course, the amount of money Israel invests in its defense is much more than Japan. So there are a lot of uncertainties there.
So a pragmatic, non-ideological look at the situation, observing some of the military trends. What about policy? Have Japan been taking any policy measures, whether it's sanctions, aid, votes at the United Nations, that suggest where Japan stand on the issue?
I think if you ask the Japanese, the leaders, they'd probably say, please don't ask me. I don't want to tell you.
Economic growth under Xi is suffering, and fears of a global recession triggered by the war in Ukraine have hit confidence. Any hint of China's future direction will be followed closely around the world. A burning question hanging over the Congress is succession. Who comes after Xi?
That report by DW's Clifford Coonan, who joins me now in the studio. So let's follow up on that last line of your report. There doesn't seem to be a succession plan of any kind.
I think the most important succession in the world is China, and who will succeed Xi Jinping. So we talked about how individual politicians have an impact on the policies of the country. And when it comes to Xi Jinping, he's been in power for 12 years now. I think his original intentions were good. He built the Belt and Road Initiative because he wanted to create a community of regional countries, a common sphere of influence where they have a shared destiny. And if China grows, all the neighbors grow, and they will become China's friends. I think that was a good vision. And also his anti-corruption campaign was also good. But what Xi Jinping totally, I think, miscalculated and misread was the speed with which China was rising, boosted by this confidence that China will overtake America during Xi Jinping's reign. His critical mistake is that he stopped reforming China to fit with the international order until Hu Jintao, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, all these generations of Chinese leaders always tried to reform China in any way they could do. Of course, not becoming fully democratic or anything, but they dipped their waters in market economy and they tried to become a responsible player in the international stage. In the UN, they were very big on peacekeeping operations. To be accepted into the international community as a respected major player, Xi Jinping's worldview is very different. He thinks the international community should reform itself to adapt to the rising China. China is big, China is strong, China is rising, therefore the world has to accept China in the way that we are. What he's not saying, but what he really means, is that the Chinese Communist Party is here to stay, and you might not like it, but you have to deal with it because we're big and we're strong and we're powerful. So that logic is not going to win any friends in the region, quite frankly. And so what will be crucial for China and for the rest of the world is that Xi Jinping's successor has a different worldview. It's okay for China to be the world's number one, China to be strong, but it has to at least try to adapt to and address the concerns of its neighbors and to be a responsible international citizen rather than demanding that the international system adapt to accept China.
So, Ken, is there really hope and optimism that the successor is going to be someone with a very different approach to these kinds of issues? Are there ideas of who those individuals might be and how soon they might become the leader of China?
I am encouraged by the fact that all of the regular Chinese people I know desire to live in a world where they are respected, they have all the opportunities. I feel for them because they are not accepted into American universities. They have difficulty getting visas, and like all the talk in Washington is about how to counter China. I don't think that's the kind of world my Chinese friends want to live in. The immediate successor might be somebody that Xi Jinping chooses, but I don't feel that somebody who is not aligned with the desires of the regular Chinese people will last that long. In 2001, when China joined the WTO, that wasn't Xi Jinping's China, that was Zhu Rongji's China, Zhu Rongji, the premier, who had a very reform-minded worldview. People look back at that acceptance and say it was wrong to accept China into the WTO. I don't think that's the case. So there is a possibility that the post-Xi Jinping era will be a Zhu Rongji China. And that would be very interesting. As a journalist, that would be a fascinating topic to cover, I think.
Ken, you've acknowledged the future succession in China as being one of the most important ones. We also might be looking at a succession here in the United States soon enough. We started this conversation a little bit by talking about this, but let's talk a little bit more about how Japan are looking at the presidential election. Some of what you've just been describing, I think, is interesting with the U.S. election in mind. Donald Trump was known in public imagination, at least, as being a kind of China hawk the first time that he emerged as a presidential contender. But recently, it doesn't really seem that way. It seems as though he's moved very much in the other direction. There's been a few hints of this, I think. The first is that he's made a business deal with a gentleman who's heavily invested in TikTok, and he's now completely reversed his position on TikTok. There's also a story in the New York Times recently about how the Chinese are preparing an information campaign similar to the ones that the Russians did in the 2016 cycle to benefit Trump's candidacy, running info ops on social media and elsewhere to try to promote Trump's candidacy because they believe that it will benefit them. So I wonder if the Japanese leadership are looking at a potential return of Donald Trump to the White House in that kind of direction, a friendlier U.S. to China and maybe a more hostile U.S. to the lattice work of defense alliances that Japan have been interested in building with the U.S. and like-minded partners in this period. What do you think about that?
I don't think so. I think what's important for Trump, the one consistent that he has had since the 1980s is his focus on trade. I think trade for him is more important than national security, and that America's trade deficits is something he wants to fix and he wants to be remembered for. If he does have a second term, he would work, I think, on his legacy. And if you think of his legacy, he would be wanted to remembered for reducing America's trade deficit, because that's the one thing that he's been constant on. And that's why I think Robert Lighthizer will have a very important role in the second administration. If you listen to the things that Trump has been saying on the campaign, it's like, when I was president, we had tight borders. I didn't start a war. there was no inflation and the gas prices were cheaper. So those are true, and those are things he's proud of. So I don't think he would be wanted to be remembered for flip-flopping on China or signing a big deal with China. I think he wants to have put America in a better place trade-wise vis-a-vis China. So I am not that worried, but maybe I'm too optimistic.
Well, I think his idea about how to do that, even in the first administration, was just to sell more things to China, wasn't it? They did that phase one trade deal when they were trying to wind down their tariff war. And what they asked for was just that the Chinese would commit to buying more American products. Even if we take at face value that his interest is in reducing the trade deficit, that doesn't necessarily mean a more hostile posture towards China. It might mean his efforts to try to make the American and Chinese economies closer in certain ways, right?
Well, so this goes back to which side the Chinese want. And I talked to somebody at the Chinese embassy the other day and asked, does China want a Trump presidency or a Biden presidency? And this person said, well, the Trump first presidency was not necessarily hostile to China until COVID. And Trump blamed China for ruining his presidency through COVID. So they believe that Trump, without the COVID, could be handled. But if you flip it from the other side, if you think of why Trump rushed into that phase one trade deal, I think he was a little desperate. He felt that he would have a tough time in the election because of China. So he needed something. So he kind of rushed to get that deal. I don't think he was very happy with the deal. At least I don't think Lighthizer was very happy with that deal. So I have a feeling that that is not the kind of deal that he will be seeking in the second term.
I suppose it's just one of many examples of how the Chinese and other American rivals benefited from his weakness, insecurity, inconsistency, lack of strategic ability. And that's probably why, to a large degree, they might be encouraged to see him return to the White House, and why, according to the New York Times, they're going to try hard to help him achieve that, because they know that they'll, in so many ways, benefit from a figure of that kind of weakness and instability as U.S. president.
Yeah, so that comes to the role of Japan. I think Japan understands that and will try to encourage and support Trump into making a substantial trade policies that would be logically supportive for Japan to be able to support logically.
Ken, we're talking throughout this conversation about Japan's change in their military and defense posture to being more assertive. It seems like something that would probably increase if the United States elected a figure who put a very weak America on the world stage, someone who was not reliable in the defense partnerships, someone who removed America's role in global leadership. Do you think that in the event of a Trump election, Japan would take a even more assertive approach to defense and security issues, maybe even pursue the kinds of defensive tools that have so far been completely off the table, something like a nuclear weapon?
If Trump comes back, the big deciding point for Japan will be 4 years later, 2028. When Trump won't be able to run again, then America will be choosing its next leader. China very well may have a new leader too. If it's Xi Jinping again, in his late 70s, then Japan would continue to side with Trump. But if it's a Zhu Rongji type of reformist Chinese leader, and then there is a MAGA leader in America, then that'll be interesting too. I don't think Japan acquiring nuclear weapons is the only way forward. they might seek better relations with China. But, this strengthening of the defense posture only continues if China has a leader like Xi Jinping who isn't willing to adapt China to the international norms, but rather believes that China is big, so therefore it's right. So that kind of world Japan cannot live in.
So I suppose there's then the idea that Japan could wait out a second Trump presidency, knowing that legally it can only last for 4 years. And this Chinese succession is really the more important thing to watch. And the American election, the American succession, maybe doesn't loom quite as large as some people might assume.
Yeah, but I think there will be broad support for this defending the international order. The so-called global south is a little tricky, especially if India becomes a superpower. And India, too, doesn't want to live in the current international order and demands that the world accept India for what it is. Then that'll be another issue. So I think Japan will be closely watching India and the global south, trying to convince as many, especially the Southeast Asian countries and the neighboring countries, to unite with Japan to defend the current order, free, rules-based, and open Indo-Pacific.
I think that India's position in the world and the direction that they're moving in is a great conversation for our next chat. And just before we go, I just want to ask you one final question. And hopefully this is on a little bit of a lighter note than what we've been talking about most recently. But there's been a very improbable figure chosen as the U.S. ambassador to Japan, and that's Rahm Emanuel, the former White House chief of staff and member of Congress and mayor of Chicago. When you think of the character of Rahm Emanuel, his brother was the basis for the character of Ari on Entourage, as someone who's known for being a bit coarse. It's someone that you would associate with diplomacy necessarily. So it's very interesting that he's taken on this role. And it seems as though he's had a lot of success at building a positive relationship with the Japanese leadership. Can you tell us a little bit about this charismatic and intriguing new ambassador and how he's been received in Japan?
Right. So when he was nominated, there was a lot of surprise in Japan about why we are getting this very famous person, but not with much diplomatic experience. But I think Japan has been pleasantly surprised by how effective Ambassador Emanuel is. I did a profile story on him recently, so I got to talk to a lot of people he engages with and got to see up close how he conducts his job. He's a politician, and politics is about give and take. You help somebody, and they help you back. And it's built on those relationships. And Rahm Emanuel has 20, 30 years of those helping others and being helped by others. Career diplomats certainly don't have that. And many of the former US ambassadors to Japan were mostly semi-retired, so they didn't exercise that power game to the extent that Rahm Emanuel does. And so that's really been fascinating to watch. In January of 2022, he knew that he had to establish himself, win the trust of the Japanese leaders. So what he did was that he understood that Kishida had become prime minister October 2021. So several months earlier, but he had not secured a visit to the White House, first of all, but even a telephone conversation with Biden yet. And this was very embarrassing for Kishida. So Rahm Emanuel sensed that the Japanese were pretty desperate on this issue and made a point of trying to make it happen. So he knew the people in the White House who were handling Biden's schedule. So he went there and made the phone call happen. And he did it intentionally to show the Japanese side that working with Rahm leads to good results. So he started off on a strong note, and he's been running ever since. And he has not been shy in using his Rolodex connections back in Washington to raise the awareness of Japan and the Indo-Pacific on Capitol Hill, especially. He would call people randomly. Every day he calls somebody, but he would call, like for instance, Chuck Schumer, he calls every 2 weeks. Which Japanese ambassador to Japan calls the Senate Majority Leader twice a week? Once every 2 weeks, rather. But he tells Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi why Japan is important. And Nancy Pelosi is like, yes, Ram, we know already.
Yeah, I remember reading a profile of him years ago when he was becoming White House Chief of Staff, when he had been in Congress. And they said that he makes 500, 600 phone calls every single day, that he's pretty much just dialing and calling someone every 2 minutes. It's hard to imagine why someone would want to live that way, but makes him perhaps an unconventional diplomat, but perhaps an effective one.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating to watch.
Ken, thank you again for joining us. I don't know how many times we've had you as a guest now, at least 3, 4, and hopefully we'll continue our conversation again soon. Always great to have a friend of the show, and I hope that our listeners have enjoyed this as much as I have and learned as much as I have about Japan, the U.S., and these big global questions.